James Christopher Frey was born September 12, 1969, in Cleveland, Ohio. Frey's early life was spent in Ohio and Michigan. His father was a successful business executive, and the Freys were a financially comfortable family. After graduating high school in 1988, Frey attended Denison University in Granville, Ohio, where he was a member of the Sigma Alpha Epsilon fraternity. In 1993, at age 23, he entered Hazelden Clinic for drug and alcohol rehabilitation. He spent 6 weeks there as a patient. Following this, Frey held a number of jobs, ranging from janitor to screenwriter. His screenplay for Kissing a Fool was made into a movie starring David Schwimmer in 1998. A Million Little Pieces, an account of his stay at Hazelden, was started in the late 1990s. To complete the book, Frey mortgaged his house and lived on the proceeds while he wrote. Frey claims that he initially tried to sell the book as a work of fiction, but 17 publishers rejected it. The book, first published in May 2003, was classified by both Frey and the publisher Random House as a memoir, or a narrative taken from personal experience. Early on, a handful of critics questioned the truthfulness of the book, but Frey's claims of its veracity went largely uncontested. In 2005, talk show host and magazine publisher Oprah Winfrey selected A Million Little Pieces for her book club, bumping Elie Wiesel's Night for the December slot. Sales of Frey's book shot into the multi-millions, and Frey appeared on The Oprah Winfrey Show to speak about his experiences as an addict and his eventual rehabilitation. In January of 2006, The Smoking Gun, www.smokinggun.com, an investigative website owned by Court TV, began a search for a mugshot of Frey to put in their gallery and were surprised to find almost no records of Frey's multi-state criminal activities. Digging deeper, they uncovered one police report that had missed Frey's attention. It detailed a major event described in the book, in which Frey, high on crack, hits a police car and almost starts a riot. The reality was that a slightly inebriated Frey ran the wheel of his car up onto a curb and was taken into custody in an extremely uneventful arrest. In the book, this is a crime that threatens to land Frey in maximum security prison for several years, until Leonard and Miles Davis, James's closest friends at the clinic, work to have the sentence reduced to 3 months. The crime is more or less fiction, and the sentence is completely so. Frey's actual jail time amounted to a few hours, and it occurred on the night of his arrest. With this information, related parts of the story were called into question. Up to the point of the Smoking Guns investigation, Frey claimed the book was completely honest, and that he had only changed some names to protect the identities of the people involved. He also claimed that his publisher had contacted people portrayed in the book and verified what he had written. In interviews, including one for Barnes & Noble's Meet the Writers program, Frey went as far as to describe his activities during the non-existent 3-month jail term, down to listing the books he read while whiling away time in his cell. Frey appeared on Larry King Live on January 11, 2006, to defend himself against the charges. He admitted some alterations, but repeated that he stood by the essential truth of his book. Oprah Winfrey called the show while Frey was on the air and voiced her support. She would soon withdraw it. Over the next few days, the case against Frey grew too overwhelming to ignore. Frey was called back to Oprah's show along with his publisher, industry veteran Nan Talese, on January 26, 2006. The result was a blistering hour-long program, in which Frey finally admitted that he lied about some of the events. He did not recant his decision to label the book a memoir, and he still claims to have documentation to support much of the story. The controversy surrounding A Million Little Pieces has led some journalists and readers to call for strict fact-checking of all non-fiction books. Many supportive fans have touted its essential truth, a phrase used by Frey during his interview on Larry King's show to denote the story's emotional impact. Still others are simply wondering whether the book should be categorized as fiction or non-fiction. Random House, publisher of both paperback and hardcover copies of the book, has simply issued an apology. A publisher's note and an author's note will appear in all new printings. Frey's follow-up to A Million Little Pieces, My Friend Leonard, starts on the 87th day of his fabricated 90-day stay in jail and is also billed as a memoir. It contains a note to the reader explaining that some elements of his story have been changed for the book within a month of Frey's public outing at the Smoking Gun. Louisiana Weekly uncovered a bizarre tale of a gay erotic writer masquerading as a Navajo writer. That writer, Tim Barris, had been writing as Nasty since 1999 and had won numerous awards for his memoirs. Novelist J.T. Leroy, presumed to be a young man who wrote gritty novels based on his former life as a male prostitute, was revealed to be the creation of middle-aged female rock musician and her husband. Leroy went many steps further in the ruse, including using a physical stand-in for readings. These findings shook the public's confidence in the publishing industry even more so. But A Million Little Pieces, with its Oprah seal and widespread news coverage, remained at the center of the debate. The scope of the discussion ranged from the sublime to the extreme. Some commentators focused on the specific definition of the word memoir. Several widened the topic to ask if Frey's actions are symptomatic of a larger problem, the erosion of the notion of truth in modern American society and politics. James wakes up, throws up 3 times, and goes to the lounge where he reads the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. He is convinced that believing in AA is just exchanging one addiction for another. He cleans the toilets thoroughly and vomits twice more. He feels no sense of accomplishment and vows not to clean them again. Returning to his room, he finds a copy of the big book and the Bible on the nightstand. He throws them out the window. He goes to the bathroom and tries again to look into his own eyes, but fails. In the shower he realizes that he is responsible for his own loneliness. He also thinks of Michelle from junior high school, his only friend. James helped her to lie to her family about a date she was going on with a high school student. While on the date, the car Michelle was riding in was struck by a train, killing her instantly. James goes to bed and has a dream in which he finds a loaded gun under a bag of cocaine and puts the barrel of it in his mouth. As he pulls the trigger, he wakes up. He goes to the bathroom and vomits. Warren and James's new roommate, the bald man, are in the bathroom. Warren holds James while he vomits. When Warren tries to get some help, James refuses. Warren loans James one of his shirts because James's is covered in vomit. James is moved by the gesture. At breakfast James fills his plate and eats voraciously. Looking around the dining room, he notices divisions between the poor, the middle class, and the wealthy, and he sees a further division between the wussies and the hardcore. Leonard sits with him and tries to make conversation, but James doesn't feel like talking. He leaves, gets more food, and eats again. He leaves the table and sees Lily. He's struck by her beauty. After lecture, Ken takes him to a meeting with Dr. Baker, who tells James that he's done so much damage to his body that he will die the next time he uses drugs or has a drink. James has suspected this for a long time, so the news brings a strange kind of relief. He goes back to his room and sees that someone has put the copies of the AA book and the Bible back on his bed. James stuffs them into the garbage can, He decides that he is going to kill himself during lecture after dinner. Roy and Lincoln walk into the room, and Roy claims that James did not clean the toilets, leaving them filthy. James says that he cleaned the toilets that morning. He and Lincoln have a standoff. After lecture, Roy and another man graduate from the facility. James gets ready to leave. He puts a note in the jacket that Hank loaned him, thanking Hank for his kindness and friendship. He folds Warren's shirt and leaves a note. Leonard comes to join him, but James tells him, "Have a nice life," and then leaves. On the way out he spots Lily through the glass corridor separating the men from the women. He stares at her and takes in her beauty. At lecture Leonard tries to talk to him again, but James ignores him. James walks out of lecture and out the doors of the facility. Leonard follows him out and tries to convince him to try again. James attacks Leonard, grabbing his Adam's apple, but Leonard refuses to let him go. James agrees to 24 more hours. The two return to the facility. James is confronted with the Alcoholics Anonymous method of recovery several times in this chapter and quickly decides that it is a crutch, a wimp's way out. As life at the facility continues and the 12-step program continues to pervade lectures, classes, and group therapy sessions, James is forced to either find a way to accept the 12 steps or find something of his own to believe in. His own growing humanity provides a handy outlet to this. To this point, James has never thrown up in front of others, but Warren and the bald man are on hand this time, and James is forced to finally show others just how sick he is. The vomiting worries Warren enough that he wants to call a doctor, but James won't allow him to. Warren is forced to settle for helping James by loaning him a clean shirt, even if it's one that James would never wear himself. In fact, it's such a nice shirt that James feels strange wearing it. Still, he accepts the shirt, much as he did Hank's offer of a jacket. He is learning to take help from others. He can no longer pretend that he is living in a vacuum. Other people exist, and he must interact with them. Every morning James stares at himself in the mirror, looking for the person he thinks lives under the scars and the black eyes, but he cannot bring himself to confront whoever that is. The only person he can really talk to and face isn't even alive. This is Michelle, his friend from middle school who died in an accident. He says that he believes he may die soon and that he hopes to see her wherever they end up. But then he comments that he doesn't believe that she's in a better place or that there is a heaven or a God, which reveals some conflict of faith. He believes that they've both been wronged as far as her death goes. He was blamed for her death while the boy she was actually with got away scot-free, and she didn't deserve to die. He shows a strong sense of self-righteousness, deserved or not, and exposes the fact that he seems to feel as if life has dealt him a rough hand despite his loving family and privileged upbringing. James shows a fairly profound selfishness here. His friend died in an accident, and yet the person he feels sorry for is himself. James has dreams in which he's abusing drugs and alcohol. He revisits some of the places he's been while on drugs. He wakes each time struggling to remember the good in his life and reminds himself that he has more than he needs. In the shower, he observes that he's becoming more of a human being. He tries once more to look himself in the eyes and finally succeeds, noting that they are pale green. He goes downstairs to smoke a cigarette and have a cup of coffee and sees Leonard coming back from a jog. Leonard asks James about Lily. James asks how he knows. Leonard says Ted told him. James sits with his friends at breakfast and talks about the upcoming heavyweight championship. Maddie knows both the fighters. Joanne and James talk about the 12-step program. James still refuses to follow it. He hints that he does not like churches and priests. Joanne insists that the program is not about God. At lunch with Leonard and the usual crowd, Bobby, the new man, starts talking trash about Mikey the Nose. Leonard doesn't make a move, he just watches Bobby more closely. After lunch, Ken approaches James and asks him to sign a release so that the facility can start helping him to resolve his legal issues. James is wanted in 3 states. Ken also tells James that he's worried about James hanging out with Leonard. He tells James that Leonard is involved in the mob and that being involved with Leonard could hurt James somehow. James tells Ken that Leonard is a trustworthy friend and that he does not intend to stop being friends with him. Against his wishes, James's parents have enrolled in the family program and are arriving from Japan the next day. James is livid but controls it. He leaves Ken and goes outside to think. He meets Lily at their appointed place and time and tells her about the girl from his past. He tells her that he fell in love with her but that when they were at a bar together he was arrested by the local police and the FBI for dealing drugs. The girl from James's past told him that she wanted him to be who he is around her and not some person that she heard bad stories about. James agreed to try, and they got together. Lily says that she wishes she were the girl, because she wants someone to love her. James tells Lily that his parents are coming tomorrow and that he doesn't want them to. She tells him he's lucky to have parents who care enough to come. James goes back to his room to find Miles sobbing. He goes back out again. At dinner, Leonard tells James that members of the facility staff have been asking him about his relationship with James and James's relationship with Lily. James walks back and watches TV. The show is about a group of ER doctors treating a heroin addict. James goes back to his room, and Miles is still crying. James leaves and spends the rest of the night watching TV. As life settles into a routine for James at the facility, he begins to explore more spiritual questions and seek deeper answers than he's pursued before. Joanne's conversation with James sets the stage for him to question the idea of a faith and a God who may be able to help him through the process of healing. But it's not until Ken reveals that his parents are arriving that James really feels the need to find a calm place. In his walk outside just before he meets Lily, he questions nature and life and all that is around him. He wonders if it is a God-given landscape, or if it is simply something that is. He wonders if he can label the beat of his heart, the feelings that are within him, as being God-given. James is having a hard time sleeping after his decision, so he spends some time outside thinking about the girl in his past that he's referred to several times before, the girl he loved. He recounts the first time he was ever in her room. By sunrise, he's convinced that he's permanently destroyed what he had with her. James goes back to his room and examines himself in the mirror. He still can't look himself in the eyes. He decides to remove the stitches from his cheek with nail clippers borrowed from Warren, which makes his face a bloody mess. At breakfast, Leonard recounts his life story. His mother and father died when he was young, he explains. He followed around a mobster named Mikey the Nose, who took Leonard under his wing and eventually adopted him. Leonard implies that he'd like to help James in the same way. James turns him down, and Leonard changes the subject to the day's football game, in which James's favorite team, the Cleveland Browns, is playing. Lincoln apologizes to James about taking Roy's side. He's learned that Roy likely trashed the bathrooms after James cleaned them. They agree to start over. James's brother Bob and 2 friends, Julie and Kirk, come to visit him at the clinic. They bring him presents, cigarettes, chocolate, clothes, and books. They watch some football together and then go for a walk in the woods, where they meet Lily and her grandmother. Bob, Julie, and Kirk urge James to try and get better and give him a list of people who have asked about him. Back at the clinic, Julie goes to the bathroom. She runs into John, who gives her his business card. James explains that John is his roommate. In the lounge, Leonard announces that he's called a Cajun restaurant to cater that evening's dinner. James goes to the telephone with his list of people. He calls the friend who put him on the airplane to Chicago, and his parents, who tell him they would like to participate in the facility's week-long family program. James refuses. He goes back to his room. John tries to make amends for giving his card to Julie by offering his daughter up to James, a suggestion that repulses James. John curls up under his covers, cursing and punching himself. James recounts John's life story of being molested by his father. At the Cajun dinner, James stuffs himself and barely makes it to the bathroom in time to throw up. Later, he gets a phone call from Lily, who tells him that her grandmother thought he had pretty eyes. James goes to sleep that night smiling. The next day, James's new job is making coffee for the group, a clear sign that he has progressed and moved further up the clinic ladder. He has breakfast with Leonard, Ted, and Ed. Ed is in rehab for the 4th time, and he tells everyone that this is the last time his union will pay for it. Ted skipped bail and is trying to lessen his sentence by going through treatment. James's psychology test results reveal that he is highly intelligent and angry and has low self-esteem. Joanne tries to convince him to accept the 12-step program, which is solely accountable for the success rate of the facility, but James refuses. James leaves Joanne's office to go to a speech by the bald man, who was sharing a humiliating story of how he was so drunk that he peed all over his clothing in front of his daughters and neighbors and had to be restrained with a dog leash. This is a serious moment for the bald man, a moment in which he reveals when he knew he had hit rock bottom. Despite stern warnings from Lincoln, most of the men laugh, and the bald man leaves the room sobbing. James goes outside to think and comes to the conclusion that he must try to get sober. At the opening of this section, James is counting down the 24 hours he has promised Leonard he will remain in the clinic, and he is taking an inventory of damage. He notes that he just doesn't want to look like Frankenstein anymore, but the reader can infer that he's not just fixing his face so he can die pretty. James finds unexpected satisfaction from his visitors. Although some small part of him may have expected his brother to come visit, he certainly does not expect to see Kirk and Julie, people with whom he assumed he'd burned bridges. One critical detail that the narrative omits is just what egregious harm he'd done Kirk and Julie, to make James think that they'd never want to see him again. Kirk treats this past situation just as it ought to be treated, simply by not speaking of it. The visit also effectively joins past and present in James's life. His old friends and his brother spent some time watching a football game played by James's favorite childhood team, but they are watching in the facility, where James's current life is. At the same time, the brief conversation with Lily and her grandmother in the woods implies that there is a future to speak of. James wakes up in the dark in his new room. In the bathroom, he makes an attempt to look himself in the eyes, but fails. He bumps into Roy, who tells him that his job is to clean the group toilets. After cleaning the toilets, James goes back to his room and vomits. James sits by himself at breakfast. After breakfast, he is driven to a dentist appointment by Hank, a recovering alcoholic who now works for the clinic. In the dentist's office, James recognizes a picture book Babar the Elephant being read by a little boy. The dentist tells James that he'll have to come back in a few days so that they can do root canals on his 2 front teeth and cap the teeth next to his front teeth. At lunch, James meets Leonard, a man who claims that James has been calling him Gene Hackman for days. There's a small confrontation after which Leonard and James become friends. James infers from their conversation that Leonard's line of work is not legal, and that he makes an enormous amount of money. This is oddly comforting to James. At lecture, James starts to feel sick. He deals with it by squeezing his face, the pain taking his mind off feeling sick. On his way back to his room, Ken calls him in to take the a personality test. There are 557 true/false questions on the exam. James is able to answer all but one, whether or not his sins are unpardonable. After the test, James makes some calls to his friends and family. They inquire after his health. He calls his mother and father in Chicago. He tells his brother to come to visiting day if he can. James has dinner alone. He goes to lecture and gets his first taste of the 12-step program and then goes back to his room to play cards with his roommates. Larry has just found out that he has HIV and is worried he gave it to his wife and kids. That night, James has a dream about sitting in front of a pile of drugs, using them all, and enjoying the high. He wakes up, takes a shower, and gets sick, as usual. Afterward, he feels very emotional and cries, thinking about his life. When he comes out of the bathroom, his roommates tell him that Larry has left, and no one knows where he's gone. James cleans the toilets. When he's done, Roy gives him a hard time about the state of the toilets yesterday and challenges him. James feels trapped and angry. Something he calls the fury begins to rise in him and he throws Roy around in front of everyone. James goes to his room and destroys everything he can before he gets a sedative to calm down. He wakes up in a different room. Ken brings 2 new people to visit him, Lincoln, his unit supervisor, and Joanne, a staff psychologist. They talk about the incident with Roy. James is instantly at odds with Lincoln. Joanne asks to speak to him alone and offers to help. At lunch, Leonard introduces James to 2 of his friends, Ed and Ted. After lecture, Hank gives James a warm coat and a pair of tennis balls to squeeze if he is afraid or in pain, and drives him to the dentist. James asks to hold the Babar book from the waiting room during the procedure. The dentist tells James that he is not allowed to have any painkillers because of his drug use, and he must be strapped down to keep him from jerking around while the procedure is going on. When the horrific scene is over, Hank drives James back to the clinic. On the way, James passes out from the pain. James's attempt to look himself in the eyes is an early indicator of his desire to get better. He also feels regret for the first time in the narrative. There's the impression that James is beginning to really consider his life and how he ended up in his current position. At the dentist's office, we see even more humanity emerge. James is struck by the sight of a little boy reading a book that James himself enjoyed when he was a child, and he's touched by the way the boy's mother protects him. James lets on that he's feeling guilty for putting his mother through any pain. At this stage in the book, James is beginning to reveal his need to feel. He has a real desire to experience emotions to the extreme. Frey spends 8 pages recounting the horrible experience of going through 2 root canals, 2 tooth cappings, and a cavity filling without Novocaine. He is almost elated at this extreme sensation, after so many years of not remembering or feeling anything. He is clearly in shock after the procedure but refuses treatment, choosing to feel the pain and agony. James welcomes these experiences as a vast improvement over his previous feelings of apathy. James wakes up in front of the TV. He walks back to his room. Miles is reading the Bible. Miles thanks him for allowing him time to himself the previous night. James offers to help however he can. The job board says that James is in the family program. He goes to breakfast and consumes an awful burrito as if it were the last thing on earth. Joanne walks James through the basics of the family program. The first step is telling his parents everything he's been doing and the extent of it. Daniel, a counselor in the family program, is with them. James's parents hug him, but he doesn't hug back. He tells them everything, starting with when he was 10 years old, including all of the arrests and the charges, and the skipping bail. His mother and father both cry. Joanne suggests he leave them alone with Daniel. Back in Joanne's office, she asks how James feels. He tells her that he feels as if suicide is the only option, although not one he'll pursue. He says that every time he's near his parents, he gets angry. Joanne asks if he's ever been abused. James tells her that he hasn't. She asks if James is going to meet Lily later that night, and he admits to it. She urges him to not get involved with Lily. James leaves Joanne's office and walks to lunch. He stares at Lily and tells himself that she is becoming what he wanted the girl with the Arctic eyes to become, someone who loves him. James and his parents greet one another briefly before they all go to meetings in which the addicts mingle with other addicts' family members. James sits by himself at dinner, and afterward he struggles to remain calm. He reads the Tao. Back in Joanne's office, James and his parents talk about how that morning's meeting has affected each of them. James goes first, then his father, then his mother, who ends up crying uncontrollably. James goes to his room in a foul mood and pulls off one of his toenails. The pain calms the fury. Once he's gotten this out of his system, he cleans up and leaves his bedroom. In the lounge, he sees someone who is vaguely familiar staring him down. James returns to his room and tells Miles about the shame he feels for putting his parents in pain. Miles tells him that shame is a necessary thing and tells him that he is terrified that his wife, who is arriving next week for the family program, will not want him back. James points him to Leonard and to the Tao. James goes to meet Lily. They are about to have sex when James tells her that he's never had sex while sober before. Lily tells James that she promises him that she won't hurt or leave him. James tells her that the last time he tried to have sex was with the girl with the Arctic eyes and that he couldn't maintain an erection. Lily tells him about her mother and how her mother sold her into prostitution for drugs. Lily ran away to her grandmother after 4 years of this. At school, she got involved with a crack addict. His friends start using her for sex. There is an unnamed terrible event, but Lily won't speak of it. James holds her as she cries. The arrival of James's parents at the facility unhinges him. He doesn't want to see them for obvious reasons. He clearly has not told them a whole lot about his life for the past decade or so. He also feels uncontrollably angry whenever he sees them. Joanne is trying to get him to acknowledge some deep childhood hurt, but he can't even fathom such a thing. As much as James is overwhelmed by the fury when he sees his parents, they are equally overwhelmed by a completely different set of emotions: guilt, sadness, confusion, and a sense that they've been lied to and deceived for many years. James meets with the facility's attorney, his parents, and Daniel. James learns that the charges in Michigan and North Carolina are minimal and that he'll only have to pay a fine. In Ohio, the charges are more serious, and James is facing 3 years in state prison. James says he won't go to trial because he is guilty of all the charges against him. James hugs his mother for the first time in his life. They separate, and he goes to lunch. He remembers last night's conversation with Lily, in which he told her he'd be willing to move to Chicago to be near her. James has lunch with his friends, who offer words of encouragement. James notices Bobby sitting with the man who is familiar to James, but whom he cannot place. James goes back to meet with his parents. He tells them a little about his friends and about Lily, whom he says he loves. His father says to tell Lily they said hello. At another meeting with other addicts and family members, but not his own, James learns the conventional knowledge that addiction is a genetic disease and that it is incurable. He doesn't believe it, choosing instead to label it a decision. Back at the unit, the bald man is graduating. He cries again, but this time he gets a standing ovation. James goes to call his brother and some friends. One of his friends has been drinking. He calls 3 of his friends who are also friends with the girl with the Arctic eyes. Back in the dining hall, James spots Lily, who stares at him angrily and looks like she's been crying. He tries to find out why by gesturing at her, but she doesn't say anything. He goes to dinner. Ed is leaving the next day. He is eager to see his 4 sons. James goes back for another family meeting, in which he tells his parents about the fury, noting that it seems to get worse whenever he's around them. His mother and father reveal that James's grandfather was an alcoholic and that James had a horrible ear infection when he was a baby that went unnoticed and unchecked until he was 2. He had to have operations until he was 12 to fix the problem. James refuses to blame his current condition on his past and says that he must take responsibility for what he does and what he's become. They part with a hug and James goes back to his room. James and his parents reach several milestones in this section, but probably the most important is James's willingness to initiate physical contact with them. He says he can feel the fury rising but quells it. James is learning that instant gratification is perhaps not a part of the solution. He also feels a small sense of joy when he initiates contact with his parents. He seems almost surprised to discover that this act creates an immediate sense of family. The entire time he was looking for something, it was right there all along. All he had to do was give in a little and accept some help from those who were closest to him. Another important step is James's decision not to hide his friends and his girlfriend from his parents. He makes a conscious effort to disclose everything about his current life, telling them that his best friend is some sort of mobster, that his other friends are crackheads and drunks, and that his girlfriend is a pill popper and former prostitute. He finds that his parents are most concerned with whether his friends are nice people and whether he loves his girlfriend. This knowledge is refreshing, and it gives James the capability to be more honest with them as time goes on and as they begin to mind the important parts of his life. When faced with the reality of state prison, James realizes that there can be no more running. He is finally aware that he must take responsibility for his actions. The disclosure that James's grandfather was an alcoholic and that his first 2 years were completely consumed with a horrible ear infection, explaining why his first memories are of anger and pain, is a true test of whether James can take responsibility for himself. He notes that these 2 explanations are viable enough to allow him to absolve himself of the past 23 years of pain and damage. But in the end, James chooses to believe that he is responsible for his own actions. The bald man's graduation marks a pinnacle in the maturity of James Frey. At past graduations, he has been indifferent, cynical, or sad. But at this graduation he is visibly moved. He feels chills up his back, and he feels hope for the first time. Lily's anger at James is cause for concern, certainly. But that doesn't seem to dampen his deep sense of contentedness. This chapter of James's life closes with him realizing ultimately that the act of drawing strength from others and acting as a possible source of strength is the most effective form of killing the Fury. James has terrible dreams after returning to the clinic and seeing Lily taken back into the detox unit. He goes to see Lincoln, who tells him that James's behavior while retrieving Lily is something he has never seen before. He also says that Lily is doing okay but that her grandmother will need to pay for another term at the clinic. Ken and James meet with Randall, the clinic attorney, who delivers the news that James's sentence in Ohio has been reduced to 3 months in a county jail and 3 years probation. Ken tells them that it's also time for him to run through steps 4 and 5 of the program, which involve writing down an inventory of his misdeeds. Step 5 is admitting to yourself, to God, and another human being the exact content of the inventory. The clinic has an experienced priest who normally assists in this step. James is wary, but he agrees. Back in the unit, James notices that there is a new man who has tattoos and a fetid, rotting odor. The man is missing one arm and the other is missing from the elbow down. James goes back to him room and reads the towel. Miles comes in and tells James that things have not been going well with his wife. James gives him a hug and holds him. Back in the lounge, Leonard makes an announcement. He has been told that he is free to leave the clinic the next day, so he has arranged for a lobster and steak dinner on cable television to watch the boxing match. The unit erupts with joy. At the dinner, James tries to help the new man with no arms get some food but is rudely rebuffed. James gets his own food and sits with Leonard and watches the fight. The night is so enjoyable that none of the men want to go to bed. James has a new job the next day. It is greeter. He sits with his friends at their usual table and notices that there is someone new sitting by himself at the end of the table. His new job dictates that he greet the person, so he does. The man is named Michael and he is brusque at first. Michael tells his story of addiction and shame, and everyone at the table laughs at him. He is upset, but when everyone else tells him their stories, he realizes that they are all laughing with him and not at him. Joanne and James meet to talk about James's discharge. Pending his successful completion of the final steps of the program, he may leave the day after tomorrow. Leonard is preparing to leave, but before going he gives James all of his contact information. Leonard has 2 other pieces of news. First, he's paid for the rest of Lily's stay at the clinic. Second, he'd like to take James on as the son he's never had. James agrees. After Leonard's dramatic departure, James goes to lunch. He meets Miles, who tells him that his wife is going to come to the family program. James calls his brother Bob and asks if he can stay with him for a little while. He gets a pad and a pen and goes outside to work on his inventory of himself, which ends up at an impressive 22 pages. After reading it over, he indicates that there is one more thing he must confess, but that he has not written it down on the list. As James's stay in the clinic ends, new patients are being admitted who serve as markers of his progress. The first is a truly terrifying specter, a rotting husk of a human being. The man is physically injured, silent, and disgusting. Basically, he is much like James must have been on admission, even down to refusing help with his dinner. It wouldn't be too off the mark to say this man is like a ghost. He even smells like he is dying, a physical reminder to James of what he was, and what he will be if he goes back to his old ways. The second new person is Michael, who, like the bald man, tells his story only to find the men responding in laughter. The difference this time, however, is that the laughter is much more genial. There is a sense of camaraderie now that was not so apparent before. Also, we see that James can finally focus on someone other than himself. He tries to help these two men. On the telephone with his parents, he takes the time to ask how they are. The profound selfishness that marked James's early days in the clinic is starting to subside. Other people now matter. In the dinner scene, we see this calmer, more relaxed James at his best, and we see that his former behaviors are not unique to him. When presented with a nice meal, the men in the unit slip into extremely odd and somewhat repulsive eating habits. They cram whole lobster tails into their mouths, eat with their fingers, and rip at porterhouse steak with their teeth. James is reminded of his own first few days of the clinic, when he ate with his fingers and stuffed himself to the point of vomiting. This is the nature of addiction. The hunger, the need, the greed, these things are lessening for James. He now eats like a normal human being. He savors every bite and tastes the food. The dinner scene also marks the second time that Leonard has commanded the evening and brought some life and joy into the world of the clinic. Leonard's influence is tremendous, and he offers the most valuable thing possible, hope. Though he eats as messily as the other men, he remains a deeply civilizing force. An angry Lily comes to James's room in the middle of the night. She is convinced that James has been speaking to someone who said horrible things about her and that hearing those things has frightened him away. She says that if it turned out that he didn't want her anymore, she would panhandle or otherwise find money for a bus ticket back to Chicago, say goodbye to her grandmother, and then commit suicide by overdosing. James reassures her that he'll never leave her. James tells Lily about his parents and that he loves her. Back in the unit, Leonard tells James that family is the most important thing anyone can have. James goes back to his room and spends some time looking himself in the eyes. James finally places the man he cannot remember. It's the same guy who threatened him on James's first day. The guy tells stories about Lily having sex with numerous men at one time, for the most part against her will. James controls himself for a time, but then tells the man to back off. He ends up hurting the man by squeezing his Adam's apple. There is another blow yet to come. James's parents tell him they have to leave the family program early because of his father's business obligations. James is angry, but he controls it. They talk about James's plans for after he gets out of the clinic. James says he's not planning on following the 12-step program, but that he's going to make the decision every day not to use and drink. Joanne, once again, explains to him that he is almost destined to fail if he chooses this route. James tells his family that he is going to be living with Lily when she gets out of the Chicago halfway house and he gets out of prison. James's parents leave the clinic. At lunch, James and his friends talk about the forthcoming heavyweight fight. They want to watch it but can't because it's on cable. Lily has left a phone message for James to call her. Her grandmother has cancer. She says she needs to see James. James takes the risk and goes to meet her. Lily and James get caught by Lincoln, who escorts Lily back to her unit and tells James to stay in his room until he comes for him. James begins to realize that they could both get kicked out of the clinic when they need it the most. Lincoln and James have a conference. Lincoln tells James that Joanne intervened and that James gets to stay as long as he sticks strictly to the rules. James is relieved but finds out that Lily suddenly left the clinic when she heard she wasn't going to be able to see James anymore. James remembers their conversation about suicide and runs out of the clinic to find her. He takes the towel with him. Hank and Lincoln intercept him in the van. The three of them drive to the Minneapolis bus station, where James hears of Lily's whereabouts from a drug dealer. He finds her in a boarded-up building among a number of users and drugs, having sex with a man for crack she's obviously already smoked. He brings her back to the van, and they all go back to the clinic. Lincoln takes her to the medical unit for detox. This section marks the climax of the story, and we see James facing some of his greatest challenges. First, James successfully battles the Fury. He comes to grips with the fact that his parents' presence causes the Fury to return. His parents' unexpected departure from the family program is a test after his realization that the Fury is exacerbated by their presence. James is surprised to see that it can also be brought on by his parents leaving. However, he quells the Fury by thinking of it in perspective of what they've all been through. The Fury comes again when James hears the man he cannot place talking poorly about Lily. The Fury is worse than it's ever been at the clinic, but James can now control it and realizes that it's at full strength because someone he loves is being debased. He takes a lesson from the Tao and lets the man off easily by remembering that an enemy is only an enemy if you let that person be one. For the first time, James feels settled and that he's done the right thing to avoid an ugly situation. The Fury also arises when James comes face to face with drugs for the first time since his arrival at the clinic. He finds that his need to save Lily is overpowering. This need transcends any other one to abuse drugs or to drink. Lily and James's roles are reversed in this chapter. When they first speak after their initial encounter, James is ripping apart a tree and needs to be comforted. This time, as Lily is distraught, James uses the same technique on her that she did on him, holding her tight and whispering, "Okay, okay, okay." They are effectively each other's addictions at this point, and this is underscored by the very tense scene during which James is holding Lily and trying to keep her from fighting him. He has her in his arms and he feels her crack pipe and the bag of drugs against his chest. He badly wants to use it, but he clutches Lily until the urge goes away. Fortunately, James has found that his addiction to Lily is now stronger than his other addictions. The relationship is also slightly unbalanced. When Lily comes to James crying, his instinctual reaction is that he promised himself that he would be there for her no matter what happened, not that he has promised Lily that he'd be there for her no matter what. It's very clear that Lily is not on the same level as James with regards to his commitment to recovery. They are clearly at different stages in their recovery. First and foremost, James's mind is on staying at the clinic and making a full recover. Lily's mind, however, is on the fact that she will not be able to function without James. At this point the reader can safely infer that James is not only addicted to Lily but addicted to the concept of being needed. He is fully ensconced in the role of nurturer and caretaker. The book opens with the narrator, James Frey, waking up on an airplane. He is bleeding, missing 4 teeth, and has a broken nose. He doesn't know how he got these injuries or where he is going. When he asks, a stewardess informs him that he is flying to Chicago, and that 2 men and a doctor put him on the plane. When the plane lands, James is unable to disembark without assistance, despite his best efforts. James's parents are waiting for him in the airport, and his appearance upsets them. They tell him that a concerned friend of his contacted them and that his injuries were the result of a fall down a fire escape. James has no recollection of this. They drive him to their summer cabin, and on the way he makes his father to buy him cigarettes and several bottles of wine. At the cabin, James's parents express their concern and love for him. Once they are asleep, James finds a bottle of whiskey and drinks until he passes out. In the next scene, James's parents and brother drive him to a rehabilitation clinic. On his arrival, An intake worker informs him that the clinic has the highest success rate of any similar institution in the world. This makes little impression on James, who dully listens to the rules of the clinic. These include not speaking to any of the female patients, except to say hello. A counselor interviews James to determine what substances he abuses. James's answers are general, but they indicate that he takes every substance he can get his hands on as often as possible. When left alone for a moment, James begins hallucinating and loses control of his bodily functions. An attendant is forced to sedate him. When James comes to, he is given pills to assist the process of withdrawal. A nurse directs him to the lounge, where he can smoke and watch television. A fellow patient starts an argument with him, because James is sitting in the man's favorite chair. The medication starts to take effect, and James begins to lose muscle control. When the nurse leaves the room, the other patient drags the helpless James to the floor and claims the chair. The next morning, James wakes up alone on the lounge floor. He manages to get back to his room, where an orderly serves him breakfast. James cannot hold down his food. A doctor comes to treat his injuries. James can't have any painkillers, so the doctor must break his nose without them. When he goes to get his next dose of pills from the dispensary, James meets and speaks to a girl named Lily. Retiring to his room, the pills again knock him out. When James next wakes, he vomits. This is accompanied by a moment of clarity in which he remembers episodes from the days leading up to his fire escape fall. They involve him abusing crack and glue and blacking out several times. Out in the hallway, James encounters Lily again. Lily explains that she is the 22-year-old daughter of a heroin addict, forced into prostitution at a young age. She is addicted to crack and quaaludes. A man named Roy arrives to escort James to his unit. Along the way, he again explains the rules of the facility to James and stresses their importance. He also warns James about talking to Lily, which is a violation of the rules. James has 3 roommates: Larry, Warren, and John. John introduces himself with a bizarre business card, bearing the words, John Everett. Sexual ninja. San Francisco and the world. He openly tells James of his cocaine addiction and penchant for anal sex. The men go to lunch, and James sits alone. On the way back, James meets Ken, his recovery counselor. Ken also interviews James and hears about the laundry list of substances James has abused over his life, as well as an account of James's crimes. James explains that he has outstanding criminal charges in 3 states. Ken encourages him to face these charges and commit to the idea of sobriety. James cannot make any promises. Although the character James Frey is very distant and hard for others to access, the writer James Frey is painfully direct and is revealed to a great extent in the very method he uses to tell his story. The length of the sentences, generally quite short, the repetitions of words and phrases, and the sporadic capitalization of nouns show Frey's blatant disregard for the rules, a theme that runs throughout the book. The use of paragraph breaks rather than conventional quotation marks without identifying the speaker shows that Frey is less interested in who is doing the speaking than in what is being said. The combined effect of these techniques is a sort of extreme first-person point of view. These are Frey's thoughts, raw. If he wants to say the same thing 5 times in a row, he does it. In removing the dialogue tags, Frey manages to claim the words of others. Their comments become words he hears in his head. The style falls somewhere between brilliantly independent and profoundly self-indulgent. But there is no mistaking the fact that this is James Frey's take on the world. From the very start, James does not rely on the goodwill of others. His interactions with the flight attendant show that he is a man who is not used to allowing others to sense any form of weakness in him. He prefers to let the world think of him as a hard and tough who can take care of himself. Although he is sure the flight attendant feels sorry for him and is smiling at him as she is speaking, he refuses to look at her. Later, when his mother tries to hug him, he rebukes her, pushing her away, indicating that his desire to remain detached is severe enough to extend to members of his immediate family. James believes that it's better if no one gets too close to him, since he views himself as a destructive, damaging force with very little to contribute to anyone's life. There is a new man at breakfast, and James recognizes him. He is Matty Jackson, former featherweight champion of the world, and he is at the clinic because he is a crack addict. James, Leonard, Matty, Ed, and Ted sit together during breakfast and at a clinic lecture. After the lecture, James goes to see Joanne and tells her he's decided to try to get sober. He says that seeing the bald man cry made him realize what true bravery is. Ken calls James into his office to ask if he's given any more thought to doing whatever it takes to get sober. Despite what he just said to Joanne, James doesn't have an answer to this question. He is still uncertain that he will be successful. Ken gives James an AA workbook which looks like a coloring book and instructs him to write down a goal on the goal board in the unit. He also tells James that Warren and John are leaving and that he will be moving into a two-person room. James says his goodbyes to Warren and John. John asks James to look up his estranged daughter and tell her that he really tried this time. James walks outside, trying to fight the fury. When it hits him, he attacks a small tree and rips it to shreds. Lily comes, stops him, and holds him while he cries. James's new roommate is Miles Davis, an older black man, a clarinet player, and a judge in New Orleans. Miles, James, Matty, Ed, Ted, and Leonard have lunch together. At lecture, James looks for Lily and is struck by how he feels when he sees her. Back in their room, Miles plays the clarinet while James reads the Tao Te Ching, and James eventually falls asleep. James wakes up to screaming. It's Roy, who's back, claiming his name is Jack, beating the couch in the lounge with a stick and threatening to kill anyone who comes near him. After he's sedated, James can't go back to sleep. He makes coffee while the other men gossip about what happened to Roy. The other men go back to sleep, and James thinks about the girl in his past. He was so struck by her that he could only stare at her until she asked him why he stared. He told her that she was so beautiful that he knew he was falling for her. James goes outside and sits on a bench at the lake. He is joined by Leonard, who tells him that he is at the facility because his mentor, Mikey the Nose, got clean after years of using and asked Leonard to do the same. Unfortunately, shortly after making this request, Mikey was killed in a drive-by shooting. Leonard says that Mikey's last piece of advice to him was to hold on. At lunch, James bumps into Lily and she passes him a note that requests an afternoon meeting. James goes to the goal board and writes that he wants to be a Laker girl. He fills out the AA workbook by writing one word on each page. He brings the book back to Ken's office and goes to his room to read the Tao again. At a unit meeting with Lincoln, Lincoln tells the men that Roy has multiple personality disorder. Lincoln and James go to a meeting in Joanne's office, where she confronts James about the coloring book and his goal and urges him to take the 12-step program more seriously. James reveals that he doesn't want safety. He wants a test of his will to be sober. James goes to the woods to meet Lily and waits. He falls asleep until she wakes him and asks if he has a girlfriend. He tells her about the girl from the past. Lily tells James that she is at the facility because of her grandmother. She asks him to tell her about his girlfriend, but he says it's too painful. She tells him to tell her about losing his virginity. He tells her a story about lying to his parents about having a date to the homecoming dance, and how he pretended he was going to the dance, when in fact he was out finding a hooker so he could lose his virginity. Lily holds him and kisses him goodbye. Later she calls him to tell him she misses him. James walks to his room. He stops outside and listens to Miles playing. He falls asleep thinking of the Tao. James has obviously turned a corner. He has a steady group of people that he sits with at every single meal, whereas he previously ate alone and ate purely to fill himself, filling the emptiness that he feels lurking within him. Now, he refers to his mealtime companions as friends and experiences a level of contentedness that he doesn't seem to remember previous to this. There is much laughing and joking at their table during lunch. James is finding that the laughter fills him in a way that blindly stuffing himself with food, or taking drugs, couldn't. He notes that it feels good to laugh, an indication that he hasn't done it in so long that he's forgotten what it feels like. James has breakfast with Maddie, who tells him that his wife is now hooked on crack, a terrifying and tragic prospect. James goes back to his room and retrieves his self-inventory, which he takes to his meeting with the priest. James reads the priest all 22 pages. The priest asks if he's finished. After a pause, James tells the priest the one thing that is haunting him. A year and a half ago, he was in Paris, seeking solace in a church. A priest in the church molested him, and James beat the man almost to death. He left before finding out whether the man had died. James sees Lily at lunch on the women's side of the dining hall. He times his visit to the conveyor belt to coincide with hers. She turns and smiles at him. Ken and Joanne review James's recovery plan with him. The plan consists mostly of AA meetings and the 12 steps. Back in his room, Miles brings in some mail for James. He has received a brown envelope from San Francisco from the girl with the Arctic eyes. It contains a stack of photos of James and the girl. James goes into the woods with the photos and his self-inventory and burns it all. James goes to dinner, where he sees Lily briefly. Miles and Michael tell him that Ted is leaving in 3 days and that Maddie's wife is missing. Later, James wakes up in the middle of the night, terrified. He walks outside and stares at the lake and comes to the conclusion that there is no reason to be afraid. The next day, he gets contact information from all of his friends. He sees Lily and he stands and stares until she runs to him. James promises her that she will hear from him every day. After saying goodbye to Hank and Joanne, James leaves the clinic. His brother and his friend Kevin are already waiting at the door for him, ready to take him back into the world. James tells Bob and Kevin that he wants to go to a bar, first thing. At the bar he asks Bob for $40 and heads straight for the bartender and buys a pint glass of Jack Daniel's whiskey. He smells it, touches it, and stares at his own reflection in it. Ultimately, he tells the bartender to pour it down the drain. James faces the prospect of jail with courage, and the very last lines express that he is now ready. Directly following this is a single page giving a terse listing of what happened to the people mentioned in the book after the events of the story took place. The majority of the patients have died, including Lily, who committed suicide, and Leonard, who died of AIDS-related complications. In the very last sentence, we find out that James has remained sober to this day. James has lost none of his bravado during his stay at the clinic. What he has done, however, is put it to a new use. Before coming to the clinic, James demonstrated his toughness by drawing everything inward, ingesting toxic substances, and shutting other people out. The energy is now going in the opposite direction. The brooding, seething energy has transformed into an ironclad confidence in himself and others. James is now willing to tell his story to a priest, no less, and at least participate in some of the steps of the clinic's program. Naturally, James participates on his own terms, but he does participate. James is intent on talking to Lily one last time, regardless of the fact that he knows that she runs the risk of being kicked out if they talk again. There's a touch of selfishness here. Lily can ill afford, either financially or physically, to leave the clinic. But James believes in their love above all else. They will solve their own problems. Finally, James makes a deliberate, public effort to face his demons by ordering and disposing of the glass of whiskey. This is a dangerous gamble, and the old swagger is evident here, but the outcome is positive. There is another important change in direction in the last pages. Instead of looking backward and dreaming of past incidents and missed opportunities, James is looking forward. He sets fire to his final inventory and the surprise package he receives in the mail from the girl with the Arctic eyes. The fact that we never do hear the full story of what happened with her is an indication that James has come full circle. Near the beginning of his stay, during his visit from his brother and two friends, James tries to excavate the past, but his friend doesn't let him. Now, as he's being provoked by someone else to bring up old memories, he passes up the bait. Though James's immediate future will be spent in jail, he faces this boldly, clearly showing that he can see beyond those 3 months. The entirety of A Million Little Pieces is told through James Frey's point of view and is strictly limited to his thoughts, emotions, and reactions. James's troubles begin roughly a decade before the beginning of the novel. James was a privileged child who grew up feeling like an outcast, despite the fact that his family was well off and fairly stable. He claims he began drinking and smoking pot at age 10. Now, at age 23, his addictions have spun wildly out of control. He is using alcohol and drugs in lethal quantities, is wanted in several states, and is blacking out constantly. When we first encounter him, he is on a plane but has no idea where he is going. He is bloody and his teeth are broken, but he has no idea what caused his injuries. His parents are waiting for him when he lands, and they take him to a world-renowned rehabilitation clinic, where the majority of the story takes place. James has problems following rules. This extends from his behavior in the clinic to the style of his writing itself. He uses no quotation marks, relying instead on paragraph breaks to denote who's speaking, even in conversations with multiple characters. His sentences are terse, and he sometimes fills entire pages with single-sentence paragraphs. He capitalizes about half of his nouns. Only a scribbled line marks the major sections of the book. As a patient, he rejects the 12-step program, the entire basis of the treatment. He rejects assistance at almost every turn. He violates a major rule and begins a relationship with a female patient named Lily. The clinic staff members despair of James and tell him that if he doesn't follow their treatment plan, he is almost guaranteed to relapse. It is understood that a relapse will likely kill him. At first, James just seems difficult and self-centered. In time, though, his stubbornness turns into resolve, and he becomes determined to get sober. He becomes part of a group of friends that come from all walks of life and transcend all social and economic barriers, including a judge, the former featherweight champion of the world, a mobster, and a steelworker. He learns to accept help from other people and also how to support others. When Lily is in trouble, James puts everything on the line to save her. In the Tao Te Ching, he finds a philosophy that complements his worldview and makes the book the basis of his personal recovery plan. In the end, using his own willpower, James triumphs over his addiction. A Million Little Pieces opens with the narrator, James, waking up on an airplane with no idea where he is going. He has a hole in his cheek, 4 broken teeth, and a broken nose. James eventually finds out that the plane is bound for Chicago and that a doctor and 2 unidentified men brought him on board. James lands to find his parents, who have come all the way from Tokyo to pick him up, waiting for him. James's condition shocks and saddens them, and they immediately drive him to the family cabin. The next day, they check him into a rehabilitation facility in Minnesota. Almost immediately after arrival, another patient pulls James to the floor when James refuses to give up his seat in the lounge. Things improve somewhat when James meets a young woman named Lily at the dispensary and a friendly, middle-aged career criminal named Leonard at a meal. Both become his friends. Near constant vomiting and pain mark James's early days at the clinic. To fix his broken teeth, James submits himself to a horrific double root canal without Novocaine. James decides that his condition is hopeless and walks out of the clinic, but Leonard follows him and convinces him to stay. James's brother Bob and 2 friends show up at the clinic unexpectedly for visiting day and bring some gifts. This show of kindness moves James deeply. After Bob leaves, James's parents call him and ask if he'll do the family program, during which they would come to the clinic and engage in counseling sessions with him. He says he doesn't want them to come. James begins reading the Tao Te Ching, and it greatly inspires him. For once, James has found something that makes sense to him, something that speaks of self-reliance. Though he knows that the clinic staff is trying to help him, he cannot accept the 12-step method of recovery, and he refuses to complete any of the tasks they set before him. One evening, Leonard sits down with James and tells him a heart-wrenching story about his upbringing and how he landed in the clinic. Near the end of the story, Leonard breaks down and cries in front of James, and tells him to hold on. From this point onward, James has a deep respect for Leonard, and the notion of holding on resonates deeply with him. In the cafeteria, Lily slides James a scrap of paper, which tells him to meet her in the clearing outside of the clinic. This is the start of the love affair between James and Lily, a relationship they pursue though the clinic's rules state that men and women patients cannot interact with each other. James and Lily often meet for long periods of time, kissing, holding each other, and talking. The relationships with Lily and Leonard are 2 of the truest that James has ever known. James's parents arrive at the clinic for the family program, despite his objections. Though seeing them is upsetting, James decides to participate. During a critical session, James finds out that he had an ear infection throughout his early childhood that made him scream and cry, which his parents left untreated. Also, he finds out that his grandfather had a drinking problem. James's parents feel that maybe his grandfather's addiction and the untreated ear infection had something to do with James's addictions, but he refuses to accept this theory. As is his way in most areas of his life, James wants to go it alone and do things deeply and completely. This includes taking all responsibility for his condition. His addiction, he believes, is no illness. It is a weakness. It can only be overcome by taking full ownership. Once he comes to this conclusion, things begin to change for James. James's parents have to leave unexpectedly because James's father has a pressing business engagement. Although their early departure upsets James, their goodbyes are on good terms. Soon after, James finds out from a distraught Lily that her grandmother is gravely ill and only has a short time to live. Lily runs away from the clinic, and James literally runs off after her. Two clinic staff members, Hank and Lincoln, follow him in a van and offer assistance. She is eventually found in an abandoned building in the middle of a sexual act, and it is clear that she has been smoking crack. Though James sees crack and has a chance to use it, he chooses Lily over the drugs. He brings her safely back to the clinic and is permitted to stay. Lily is forced to start over again with detoxification and will have to pay for another term, something she cannot afford. Continuing his quest to accept responsibility for his own life, James faces the criminal charges against him in Ohio. At first, he believes that he'll have to be in jail for 3 years, but the sentence is mysteriously reduced to 3 months. James believes that his friend Leonard and his roommate Miles Davis helped reduce his sentence, but this fact is never confirmed. Leonard completes his program and prepares to leave the clinic. Before he does, he arranges for Lily's program to be paid for and asks James to be his son. The day before James leaves to begin his jail sentence, he confesses that a priest in Paris made unwanted sexual advances toward him, and that he beat the man seriously, possibly even killing him. This admission triggers a release in James, and he knows he is ready to leave. James's brother and a friend pick him up at the clinic, and he immediately asks him to go to a bar. His brother and friend are stunned but give in to James's request. At the bar, James has Bob give him $40 and orders an entire pint glass full of whiskey. After looking at the glass and smelling the whiskey, James asks the bartender to pour it down the drain.